The big news is that the 2024 Democratic vice presidential nominee, Tim Walz, has decided to withdraw from the race.
When it rains, it just pours. It seems like a lot of states these days, or more and more, have governmental trifectas. In the Trump era, we've seen lots of trade-offs. That has probably worked to keep Minnesota to the left of the national popular vote.
Pretty routinely, Minnesota has been to the left of the country. It's sort of been a light blue state for a long time now. Welcome to the Decision Desk HQ podcast. I'm your host, Jeffrey Skelly, the chief elections analyst here at Decision Desk HQ. Happy New Year. It's now the actual midterm year of 2026. So needless to say, we'll be spending a lot of time over the next 11 or so months digging into where the electoral environment stands and what's happening in individual races all across the country. This week, we're going to explore what's going on in a couple of states that are politically competitive, but on average lean just a bit toward the Democrats. First, we'll make a trip up to Minnesota to discuss Democratic Governor Tim Walz's decision to abandon his campaign for a third term in the face of an ongoing crisis regarding government fraud and the potential entry, most notably, of Democratic Senator Amy Klobuchar to fill Walz's void. Then we'll venture to Virginia, where we will talk a little bit about what happened in the state's 2025 election, and then turn to its involvement in the ongoing national redistricting fight. The state legislature there is about to take up a constitutional amendment that would potentially allow the Democratic-controlled state government to redistrict the state's congressional map. And to help me explore these fascinating topics, I am very excited to welcome J. Miles Coleman to the podcast. Miles is the associate editor of Sabados Crystal Ball, a nonpartisan political newsletter put out by the University of Virginia Center for Politics. Miles is about as knowledgeable as they come when it comes to elections, having previously done work even for DDHQ. And if you go back a little further, garnering a lot of notoriety on election Twitter for his amazing electoral maps, which you may be able to see in the shot if you're watching. He's got a few behind him. And pertaining to this episode, he just wrote an article about the Minnesota situation for the Crystal Ball newsletter that you should all check out. I will link that in the show notes. And lastly, I should mention that Miles is a Louisianan. So while we're not going to talk about the Pelican State here, we will try to make sure to have him back on to talk gumbo politics later this year at some point. So with that, Miles, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so hey, we'll start out. We'll just get going. The Minnesota situation is sort of the big electoral news. Obviously, there are a lot of things going on in the world right now between the U.S. action in Venezuela and what have you, and the Greenland discussions. But in the electoral world, at least in the near term, the big news is that the 2024 Democratic vice presidential nominee, Tim Walz, the sitting governor of Minnesota, who had back in the fall announced that he was running for a third term as governor of Minnesota, has decided to withdraw from the race, which is big news. And, especially given his now national prominence as his party's VP nominee in the last presidential race, but also that there's this ongoing, basically a lot of it, maybe the straw that broke the camel's back. And I'm going to set you up for to hear more about this, but was this sort of this government fraud investigation that's been going on in Minnesota. And that may have been sort of the final thing that led Walz to decide he didn't actually want to keep running. And politically, it looked like it was going to be damaging for him, but there were other things going on too. So just to cue you up, the article you just put out in the Crystal Ball talked a lot about Walz's decision and some of the background of that. So I was curious, what did you make of what happened there?
Yeah, it's this is a guy who overall would say as you alluded to, he was an unsuccessful VP candidate. And it kind of continues on the streak of, former losing VP candidates, not having the best political luck after office. I mean, in your state, my kind of adopted state of Virginia, I think as Senator Kane is probably like the maybe best case, right? Because he loses, but, he still goes on to win re-election. He's very influential in state politics, generally well regarded in the Senate. But Walz, I feel like, has been like more on the opposite end of that spectrum because when it rains, it's just pours. I mean, when you think of after his loss, I mean, there was all kinds of reporting that, he used to be very close with Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan. They were on the same ticket in both 2018 and 2022. I think maybe the genesis of that may have been that looked like Walz very well could have been elected vice president. Maybe Flanagan was making some moves to kind of go forward after the election taken over. That didn't happen. You have the shooting of Melissa Hortman, who he was very close with. That was awful all around, but especially for someone like that, I've heard rumors that if he were to move forward with that third term, she would have been kind of a logical running mate. So there's that, and then there was the of course in Minnesota earlier this year there was the kind of the shooting in that Catholic church. It's just a bunch of stuff you have to kind of deal with. And then there was this fraud allegation, this kind of massive kind of basically that broke over. It's been going on longer, but it really kind of came to a head over the holiday days. And, I was telling my associate Kyle Connick here, we were just kind of, who's had the like worst posts, which of the like unsuccessful VPs have like had it worse. He brought up John Edwards, and of course he went through a bunch of trials. He had some kind of legal issues, but I was like, okay, I can see that, but at the end of the day, like I feel like Edwards is just like a scumbag in a way that Walz isn't. So, I feel like to some degree Edwards had it coming, right?
Yeah, John Edwards, he may have gotten sort of his just desserts, cheating on his dying wife and anyway, that's a whole other thing. But yes, he is a particularly notable. And then you have Joe Lieberman, of course, who was the Democratic nominee for vice president in 2000. That ticket narrowly loses in the obviously very controversial 2000 election. Then he's losing in a Democratic primary in 2006, and goes on to win as sort of an independent Democrat in 2006 for re-election. But talk about a swift fall. It reminds me actually a little bit of Mitt Romney in a certain way, who had been obviously the Republican presidential nominee in 2012. And then by 2018, 2020, the Trump era is not the most popular Republican nationally, still relatively popular in Utah, but ends up retiring rather than running again in 2024, sort of pushed to the periphery of his party. So it's kind of an interesting how things can change, and sometimes very fast in politics, and how the parties see themselves and who's sort of on top of the parties. It seems like I should just mention for people wondering about this fraud scheme, the allegations. It seems like there's a few different things going on. It has to do with perhaps some COVID era federal funding, a nonprofit group getting their hands on some of that. Also some stuff having to do with I think childcare funding. Basically, it's an ongoing case. The investigations into this, there's just basically been a lot of little dominoes falling on this, and the degree to which Walz himself is like personally involved is not. I don't think personally involved, but obviously he's governor of the state, and if this has been going on under his watch, and you're talking about estimates that federal prosecutors are talking as much as like $9 billion in fraud, that's going to look bad. So you have a bunch of personal tragedies, a bunch of difficult moments as governor, obviously coming off of losing when he could have potentially been vice president, personal strife with his and sort of disagreements with his lieutenant governor, who's now running for Senate. We should mention Peggy Flanagan's running for the open U.S. Senate seat there, where Tina Smith is retiring. And then you add in this big fraud situation, which has really sort of hit has really hit kind of the national attention to a degree that it wasn't getting previously. All this comes together, and Walz maybe decides. I mean, I think you could probably interpret a lot of different ways. He might have said, God, I don't want to go through this for another, 11 months running and dealing with questions about this. I also, potentially there have been some people who said maybe he was sort of taking one for the team, knowing that if he did go on to run, he might well win re-election because it might be a Democratic leaning midterm year with a Republican in the White House, but nonetheless, it might hurt Democrats down ballot some. And as we'll talk about, the situation in Minnesota politics is very, very evenly divided in the state legislature. And so in that sense, it's probably very good for Democrats that Walz got out of the way, because I think it does make it more likely that they're in a more advantageous electoral position. And sort of just thinking about that. So just before we go a little further into the Walz situation, let's just sort of set the stage here. Minnesota politics, sort of what to make of the state, why I would say something like Tim Walz might have actually still been able to win despite this fraud situation getting so much attention. And, I've brought up on screen, if you're watching at home, a chart basically showing the vote margin in Minnesota's most recent presidential elections versus the national popular vote margin. And pretty routinely, Minnesota has been to the left of the country. It's sort of been a light blue state for a long time now. In 2024, the most recent contest, Kamala Harris, the then sitting vice president, carried it by about 4 percentage points over Donald Trump, while Donald Trump was winning nationally by about 1.5 in the national popular vote. So, that puts it about 6 points to the left. And in 2020, it was about 3 points to the left. And the only time it hasn't been to the left of the country was in 2016, when it was basically about the same as the national popular vote, give or take a few tenths of a percentage point. But I think what that tells me is sort of Minnesota, even in a better year for Republicans in the 2024 presidential election, remained Democratic leaning, still went for the Democrats in a presidential race. And going into a midterm election with a Republican in the White House and one whose obviously his approval rating is in the sort of the low 40s, these are not the conditions where I think you would automatically expect an unusual result where a Republican ends up winning. That's not to write it off, not to say it couldn't happen, but it is to say that Democrats are probably in a position where they can count on the environment being maybe a little bit better than it was in 2024 when their presidential nominee was winning statewide by 4 percentage points. So, Miles, sort of thinking about that environmental context and thinking about the situation now with Walz out, where do things sort of go from here?
Yeah, and I think kind of adding to your charts somewhat, which I think it's a great visualization of how the state has gone over the past few cycles. I believe, like, before 2016, the last time Minnesota was right of the national vote was, I'm going to say, 52. So the Eisenhower time. So it's always been, and of course, as we can see, after 16, like, it snapped right back, So it is, I think you're right that he probably could have still won. Really, we've talked something I'm sure you've talked a lot about on here, and as many of your listeners would basically know, in the Trump era, we've seen lots of trade-offs, right? Okay, basically college educated voters going towards Democrats, rural blue collar voters going to the Republicans. That's a trade-off that has probably worked to keep Minnesota kind of to the left of the national popular vote. We've seen it, like, not to say that it's impossible for the Republicans to win there, but they can always get, I basically use the current state attorney general, a guy named Keith Ellison, as an example. He's had very close races both times he's been elected, in 18 and 2022. But, as long as the Democrats can get, 65, 70% in the core counties of the Twin Cities Metro, the Republicans just have a hard time finding votes to cancel that out. And I think also that Minnesota is a state where, like, and this was basically true during the Obama era, where, he had some very rough midterms, both in 10 and 14. Minnesota Minnesota, in both of those elections, Democrats won most of the offices there. So they did have a decent bench. That is still basically the case. I think really uh, what's most looming right now is the decision of Senator Amy Klobuchar of whether she's going to enter the race or not. She is uh, probably the most successful state politician of this generation. But even if she took a pass on the race, there are some Democrats who could give it a look. I mean, I think people would look at Secretary of State Steve Simon. He was the best performing Democrat statewide there in 22. I mentioned Keith Ellison, who would not have as much of an electability argument, but hasn't ruled it out. So yeah, it's and you'll one more thing I'll say on this is kind of going back to the to what I said a few minutes ago was that, okay, Walz could have won, but if you're a candidate for governor, your first job is to lead your ticket. We saw that in some of the races last year, and that would definitely be true in this context as well. Okay, well, he could probably just have stated by on the state's partisanship if it got to that point. But both chambers of the legislature are very closely divided. So kind of the better the top of the ticket does, the better positioned everything else is, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of maybe this is a good opportunity to transition to talk a little bit about Klobuchar. You made a fun map after the 2024 presidential election. Klobuchar was last up for the U.S. Senate in 2024, so she was first elected in 2006, has very handily won re-election in 2012, 2018, and then 2024 to the U.S. Senate. And she was one of the strongest, basically, outperformers of the presidential ticket of any U.S. senator or Democratic Senate candidate on the ballot in 2024. So I'm going to bring up this map you made, and you'll notice Minnesota here. If you're looking on, if you're watching this, but if you're listening, Minnesota is very dark blue, which in this context means Klobuchar, the Senate candidate there for the Democrats, did far better than Harris did in Minnesota. I believe Harris was winning the state by about 4. Klobuchar was winning by double digits, statewide, and that's been basically the story for her. In 2012, it was like that. She very easily won. Barack Obama didn't have like a difficult time winning Minnesota in 2012 as the Democratic nominee, but Klobuchar was a cakewalk for her. And she's basically just had that experience over and over again. So if you're thinking about the context of a very closely divided state legislature, so to put some numbers on that, the state house is basically tied 67 all. And then the state Senate is 34-33 in favor of the Democrats. And so at the moment, there's essentially it's divided government because the House has got this tie and there's a power sharing agreement. And anyway, the point is that Minnesota is not quite fully in Democrats' control. And so if you're thinking about a 2026 midterm, an opportunity for Democrats, if you see some of the same shift and swing we've seen in special elections and in other races like in 2025 that go towards the Democrats to some extent, Walz at the top of the ticket could absolutely snuff that out a little bit, or at least diminish it to a great extent. Whereas Klobuchar, and I want you to talk a little bit about this, please, Miles,
Sure.
as I zoom in here on Minnesota, did better everywhere in Minnesota, including places where Democrats have not been doing great in Minnesota.
Yeah, and when she was a presidential candidate back in 2020, something that she would always point to is at that time she had won re-election. She was initially elected in 06, re-elected 2 times. All 3 times she was on the ballot, she won all 8 of the state's congressional districts. And, she really leaned into that electability argument Just with things getting more polarized, she only won, I think, 5 this time. But her overperformance was still very impressive. Other than I think the only like actual Democrat who did better than her relative to Kamala Harris was John Tester. You did have independents like Dan Osborne in Nebraska, Angus King in up in the state of Maine, who kind of different types of races, but in terms of like nominal Democrats, she was one of the best performers. And if people can see this on their screen, then she tended to do, she was basically closest to the top of the ticket in the metropolitan areas, which isn't too much of a surprise, but you get some like really dark shades of blue in like the western part of the state, that until very recently that part of the state would do a lot of splitting their tickets for former representative Colin Peterson. So she did much better in those kind of traditionally more democratic parts of the outstate, but really overperformed everywhere.
Yeah, and I think for Klobuchar, actually, I wish I could note who said this, but she was in the conversation, I guess, for VP at least a little bit. So there is an alternate universe where Joe Biden drops out in 2024, and Amy Klobuchar is the vice president, and maybe she's president right now. But here she is potentially choosing to run for governor. And she hasn't made a decision on that yet, or at least if this recording, which is 3:30 Eastern on Wednesday, January 7th, by the time this publishes, it's possible that she'll have made a decision. So I don't want to rule that out. But it is fascinating because for someone who's been in the Senate this long to say, hey, you know what? I actually wouldn't mind going home and leaving DC is pretty unusual. There are not a lot of immediate comparisons that I can make. For instance, in 2024, you had Mike Braun in Indiana, had one term in the U.S. Senate, say, I'm going to run for governor in Indiana and go back to Indianapolis. But beyond that, to find someone who's been in the Senate for 3+ terms, has won 4 times, considering a gubernatorial race and leaving Washington, might say something about how people are viewing Washington these days. And I guess Michael Bennet in Colorado is another one. He was appointed in 2009, won a full term in 2010, and he's also running for governor. And Marsha Blackburn in Tennessee is running. And Tommy Tuberville is not running for re-election and is choosing to run for governor in Alabama. So there's a little bit of a pattern popping up in terms of U.S. senators running for governor, which historically is not really quite the direction that usually goes. Usually you have governors who get elected to the Senate and then they stay in the Senate if they can keep winning. So a fascinating shift there. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see if Klobuchar actually decides to make the move. I kind of suspect she will if this news is breaking and or has been out there, these rumors are out there, but we'll just have to see. And, we could keep talking about Minnesota. If you have any final thoughts on Minnesota, Miles, let me give it to you.
Well, one thing I wanted to say just on the phenomenon you were just talking about is, I think it's funny if you look at the recruiting for Senate races, it seems like the national parties for Senate, they have to, I feel like oftentimes governors will run for Senate, but if they do it, they're kicking and screaming, right? They don't really want to go,
Hey, John Hickenlooper in Colorado, when he ran for president, was like, I'm never running for Senate. A few months later, after he drops out of the presidential race, he's running for Senate in 2020.
And it seems like even this cycle, we do have some. Yes, they got Governor Cooper in North Carolina, but there are some other examples like Brian Kemp, Gretchen Whitmer, former Governor Chris Sununu. all taking a pass on races that, maybe if they weren't favorites, they would have had strong chances. And, there is maybe some presidential politics involved, but I think maybe the why part in terms of why so many senators are going back home. I think, as you said, there's just a lot of dysfunction in DC, and I think it seems like a lot of states these days, or more and more, have governmental trifectas, which is basically where one party has the governorship in both chambers of the legislature. No, that's true for Colorado, Tennessee, Alabama, all those states you just mentioned. And then, even though Democrats don't have one in Minnesota, as we've been saying, you could very easily see how they could get there after this election, right?
Exactly. That's an excellent point. So if you're feeling like you're not getting a lot done in Washington, or you're feeling, it's a very dissatisfying work environment, and you're a very notable politician who's popular in your state, you might look at it as an opportunity to say, well, I can go back and maybe do a few things at home, because my party has full control, or will have or likely will have full control of all the levers of power there. So obviously we could keep talking about Minnesota, but we did want to talk about Virginia for a little bit. So I wanted, you wrote something on sort of what happened in Virginia in the 2025 election that I thought was worth talking about briefly, because one of the things we saw Democrats obviously do much better in Virginia than they did in the 2024 presidential election. I mean, they were carrying the state, but Kamala Harris was winning the state, but Abigail Spanberger, the gubernatorial nominee, ends up winning, double-digit margin, handily wins. Democrats win 60 plus seats in the state House of Delegates, the lower chamber in the state legislature there. I mean, it's a very, very good cycle for Democrats in Virginia and also in New Jersey. But looking at Virginia, I think you had a really interesting finding, which was potentially, at least, the places where we saw a sort of turnout drop the most. And you saw Democratic swings, Democrats gained sort of everywhere in the state, right? So it's sort of finding the differences in what was going on between turnout, which you're not expecting turnout to be as high as in a presidential level. But if it was getting closer to the presidential level, that meant that at least a lot of the voters who turned out in the last election were showing up again. But if it was a bit lower than, say, like the state average, compared to 2024, then maybe you're getting a few more voters who were lower propensity, were more likely to show up in presidential race, not show up in a gubernatorial or non-presidential race. And so I'm going to bring up your map here that you put together on this, and I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about it for listeners and for viewers.
Yeah, so basically what this map is showing, it's trying to show both the change, just the margin change from 24 to 25, on top of turnout as well. What Jeff, what really was the kind of genesis of this, is, in my free time, because I'm a nerd, I was kind of just looking at the results, and
I appreciate
I
it.
was
I get it.
so I was trying to make a precinct level map of, so overall, so you have Kamala Harris winning by the state by roughly 6 points. Harris wins by 16, so it's just under a 10%.
Sorry, I think you meant, just to clarify, I think you meant Spanberger there, but yeah, Spanberger won by 16, so almost a 10-point difference. Yeah.
Yes. So, basically 9.6 to be precise. So, I was looking at which precincts shifted Democratic more than that and less than that. So I'm looking at trying to find the areas that shifted most towards Spanberger. And I go online the next day, and I see Chaz from State Navigate posted kind of what I did, except he looked at turnout from 24, 25. And I thought, some of the areas line up. What really struck me on election night is we did see a big snap back to Democrats in parts of Northern Virginia, specifically Loudoun, where you have heavy Asian population, especially in the eastern part. and Prince William, which has a decent Hispanic population as well. Those were areas that Trump did relatively well in last time. They shifted hard to Spanberger. And one of the things I found doing this is, a lot of those minority heavy parts of Loudoun and Prince William saw these big shifts in Spanberger's favor, but also had relatively lower turnout. Overall, something like 80% of the votes that were cast in 24 were cast in 25. So they had less than that 80%, but they also saw big percentage shifts. So where I'm going with this is the takeaway seems to be just from that data that there probably were some minority voters who maybe turned out for Trump in 24, but were not as motivated to turn out this time. So I do think, probably you did have a decent element, thinking of, why Spanberger did so well. There probably very much was an element of persuasion, especially since she ran so much on federal issues, if that's such a big issue here. But it does suggest that there was probably also an element of, Trump's people just staying home, right?
Exactly. And yeah, and that gets back. I think what's interesting here is that your map is essentially telling us something about what we call differential turnout, where for instance, in like the 2026 midterms, or say, let me back up to say the 2022 midterms with a Democrat in office in the White House and Joe Biden, we expected, and you did generally see this, Republicans on average, so take just the average Republican, was somewhat more likely to turn out than the average Democrat. And so you saw, like in states with party registration, you tended to see higher turnout among Republican registrants than Democratic registrants, especially relative to what had happened in the 2020 presidential election. And so the flip side of that is in a place like Virginia in 2025, where we don't have party registration, but you could see, just looking at the results, you could see evidence that, oh, hey, Democrats were more likely to turn out in Virginia, or people who lean Democratic or outright Democrats. But at the same time, some of what was going on there in terms of where maybe that differential turnout hit hardest was in places where the Republican turnout dropped out because of perhaps lower propensity voters, some voters of color who had come into the Republican camp, or at least Trump's camp, not turning out and voting for the Republican ticket in Virginia's 2025 election. That's like sort of, it's, was sort of a differential turnout on steroids in this case. Democratic voters in those areas were motivated to turn out, even if, maybe you can get in conversations about lower propensity voters on the whole, like certain areas being lower just across the board. But nonetheless, it seems to me this is the kind of stat that tells me that, if you're looking at 2025 and you're a Democrat and you're saying, wow, we did so great. It's like, don't be too hasty to sort of overrate what all this means in the long run.
Yeah, and there are some other things about this map that I think probably speak to the maybe other parts of the election that I read. One thing I found was that, if basically anyone who's been to Virginia or studied its politics know that basically once you go south of Charlottesville, you're basically in the deep south.
Yep.
That tends to be like it has a decent black population. It's also getting redder every cycle. So very deep south in its voting, in the types of voting attitudes that kind of has very inelastic. So it would make sense that, kind of in one of the other categories, it saw a relatively small shift to Spanberger, but also had lower turnout. Meanwhile, kind of the opposite of that is, when I first met my fiance, she lived in Richmond, and we spent a decent amount of time in the Short Pump area, which is kind of like Western Henrico, and that area is growing like nothing else. So And that's also the part of the state that Spanberger is from. I also think that voters in the capitals of states also, I just find naturally are more tuned into politics, just because it's a big part of the kind of local scene. So where I'm going with that is, in that short pump area, Western Henrico, that was one of the areas where you saw like more than 9.6 percentage shift towards Harris, right? But also did punch above its weight in turnout. Lots of the a handful, I guess, of the Democratic seats in the House of Delegates that they picked up were also kind of in that general Richmond area. So that I think is an area that is really just getting more Democratic each cycle, it seems like.
Yeah, absolutely. For people who are not familiar with Virginia politics, short pump is basically it's west of the city of Richmond, and it used to be sort of the you'd say, oh, we're going to short pump. It's like, oh, we're going to go to the outlet mall. Is basically what it has been historically. I mean, it's changing now to some extent, but that for me, having grown up in Virginia, was what, when people said, oh, we went to short pump, it's like, oh, you went shopping. Because so anyway, that's that. They're talking about the Richmond suburbs and exurbs, an area that has gotten a lot bluer over the last few years. And maybe this is an opportunity to shift quickly over just to talk for just a few minutes about the redistricting situation in Virginia, because Virginia is a state where Democrats currently hold 6 of the 11 congressional districts in Virginia. There are a couple that they are sort of targeting, I think, in 2026. They're hoping the current 1st district, held by Rob Whitman, and the 2nd district, held by Jen Kiggins, are winnable seats for Democrats, potentially, and particularly the Kiggins seat, which Kiggins won back in the 2022 midterms for the GOP. She might be facing Elaine Luria again, who she defeated in that election, was the incumbent House member who had been elected in 2018. But what's interesting is that we may not have the same map as we've had in 2022 and 2024, because Virginia Democrats are in a position where they can pursue a constitutional amendment that would permit the state legislature to draw a congressional map to essentially replace the one that came out of the bipartisan commission process that Virginia now has. It was drawn basically by 2 special masters on behalf of the state Supreme Court after the commission couldn't come to an agreement. So you have this relatively neutral map in terms of how it was drawn. Well, Democrats are looking at the whole national redistricting war that's been going on, conflict, sort of sparked by Donald Trump pushing for Republican states and his administration, people in his administration pushing for Republican-controlled states to redraw and try to help the party's position ahead of the 2026 midterms, and Democrats pushing back in places like California, most notably. But now Virginia Democrats have, because there's this bipartisan commission system, to undo that, they'd have to pass a constitutional amendment. Well, in Virginia, it's a little complicated passing a constitutional amendment. You got to do it twice. You have to do it once, and then there has to be an election for the state legislature, and then you have to do it again, and then it goes before voters to be approved. Well, right before the November election, because the state legislature happened to still be in session technically, Virginia Democrats were able to because otherwise the Republican governor, Glenn Youngkin, would have had to call them in, and he would never have called them in for this. Because the legislature was still technically in session, they met and they passed the constitutional amendment in both the state House of Delegates, where Democrats at the time held a very narrow majority, and in the state Senate, where they also held a very narrow majority. The governor has no say in a constitutional amendment passing the legislature. They passed this amendment to open the door to this opportunity. Then they win a sweeping victory in the 2025 elections. They have a much larger majority in the House of Delegates now, still a slim majority in the state Senate, but critically, they have a Democratic governor who could sign off on a congressional legislation if the state legislature passes a new map and the governor is signing off on, like standard statute, normal legislation to draw a new map under new rules, under a new constitutional amendment, changing those redistricting rules, then the Democratic trifecta there could draw a Democratic gerrymander. And basically, it's a long way of saying that for those of us who enjoy map making and toying around with maps, and especially someone from Virginia, seeing sort of what's possible for the parties, it's kind of dark, but it's interesting nonetheless. And I think what's notable is that Louise Lucas, who is one of the high-ranking Democrats in the state Senate, has been talking 10-1. She's been saying 10-1 over and over again, which honestly, until a couple months ago, I thought was like just kind of over the top, and no way would they actually go for a 10-1 map, even if Democrats were able to draw to their heart's content, because you'd leave a lot of districts. To do that, you'd have to draw some pretty ugly districts. And you'd also, that's not necessarily a hang up, but you'd also have to leave at least some element of exposure if you had a stronger cycle for Republicans. Virginia is a light blue state. This is not a state that is like California, where, it's 60% Democratic statewide, it's 52, 53% in a two-party vote kind of situation, Democratic in a presidential race. So to draw a map that would be that advantageous would require some pretty ugly gerrymandering. And so just to bring up my own example of this, and Miles, we can talk about it too, but just some hypotheticals to talk a little bit about what could be going on here. This is an example of how you draw a map that is ugly enough to get 10-1 in Virginia for Democrats. And essentially do that with 9 seats that Kamala Harris won with at least 55%, and one that she won with a little over 50%. And while maintaining actually plurality black seats in the 3rd and 4th congressional districts. And so there's a lot of moving parts here. But I think what I just want to put out to people as we talk about this a little bit is that it's a feasible thing. I'm not sure that voters will end up going along with it. And there's a lot of hoops that Democrats have to jump through to still make this possible. But in this moment of sort of this national redistricting conflict, Virginia could very quickly here in the next few weeks be on the front lines.
Yep. And, I guess maybe though, if they go through with this, maybe the political word of the year in Virginia may be bacon mander. Because that's that's what you're going to have to do with Northern Virginia in a map like this. You're going to have to string it out into 5 or 4 or 5 districts just to dilute its vote. And it's I have in my own map, I make that trying to maximize Democrats, so you can get that Charlottesville to Roanoke seat a little uglier. You can make it a little bluer. But I think you're right. Basically, they can just pack all those Republican votes into Appalachia. It is not as hard to do as I maybe would have kind of thought. But maybe one more thing I would say is it looks like if they go through with this, the kind of legislature is going to be in session by the end of the month. They've said that kind of passing this a second time is going to be one of the things that they go for first. So it looks like we would have a referendum on this to override the commissioner court sometime in the spring. One of the things that I think is most promising for it, and again, it's a lot of hoops, but I was watching Prop 50 last year in California, which was like the similar thing. And, what I was watching for is basically Harris won the state 60-40 in 24. So I was watching Prop 50's margin relative to that. And it passed by, I think, 28. It was 64-36. And so it did 8 points better than Kamala Harris. So you could say, okay, yes, Virginia is a lighter blue state. Democrats don't have as much room for error. But if it's still overperforming Kamala Harris, of course, every state's different. But I think that would give Democrats a decent cushion once they try to pass it.
Absolutely. And I think it's also worth just talking about this process for a second longer. So the legislature, I think their session opens next week or toward the end of next week. And at that point, they're talking about very quickly moving on this being one of the first things that they vote on. and try to get through is a second round and a second proving for a second time without changing a single word, mind you, because that's the only way they can amend the Constitution in Virginia is through the state legislature. There's no, in California, there's no initiative system. In Virginia, like many southern states, there's no initiative system. There's no way to change the state constitution outside of the state legislature passing an amendment twice and then the voters approving said amendment at the ballot box. And so having passed it once right before the November election and now trying to pass it a second time, it seems likely that they'll be able to pass it a second time. And then it becomes a question of, well, when do voters actually vote on the thing? And see, normally when you have a constitutional amendment in Virginia that has been passed twice and is going before the voters, it usually is on the November ballot. That's how it almost always works. Very rarely. I did a little digging on this a while back for an article you can find on our Substack, looking at all the constitutional amendment votes and other kinds of referenda votes that Virginia has had in basically the 20th century or 20th and 21st. We're in the 21st, right? 25 years into the 21st, 21st and 20th centuries. And almost every single one was in November. Very rarely. It had been, I think, in the 1950s, the last time that there was one that was not in November. And so you're going to have it's going to be interesting to see the sort of maneuvering that Democrats do, assuming they do pass it the constitutional amendment a second time, to precipitate a special election in April or May. Because in terms of timeline, that's basically what they have to do. They've got to do that. Then if they do manage to pass such an amendment to put redistricting back in the hands of the legislature, then, it takes a few weeks to certify. Then in that same process, I assume that the Democratic-led legislature would also have voted to move the state's primary back, because right now it's scheduled for June. It'd need to be probably in August or something. You got to shift the candidate filing deadlines back. But it's going to be really interesting to see because there are just a lot of moving parts here, more moving parts than there were in California, where you do have where the legislature could pass the thing once, put it on the ballot for voters to consider as a legislature initiated constitutional amendment. And it's just a little bit thornier to do in Virginia, which is why, honestly, even as somebody who has followed Virginia politics for a long time, I was very surprised when this developed, because this is really like this is really going for broke to try to do it like this.
Well, it's one of the lines that I find myself coming back to a lot is when this whole mid-decade redistricting thing first started to bubble up over the summer with Texas. To give Kyle another shout out, in his kind of initial look at the whole situation, he was like, there are some states that that probably could redistrict that won't, but there might be other states that, we think might not be able to, but find a way. That would be California, that would be Virginia. Indiana falls into that first category where they could have, but didn't. I think maybe another political angle that could be interesting is, Spanberger, one reason why she's been so successful, not just in this governor race, but in her House races as well, is she's always tried to come across as somewhat of a post-partisan figure. Always talks about how, she's towards, if she's the most bipartisan member of the Virginia congressional delegation. Well, if one of the first things she's going to have to tackle as governor is redistricting, which is the most
as partisan as it gets.
thing. Yeah. So what's that going to do for her? Or does it, is this so nationalized that it's not going to move the needle much? Which is another thing we should say is, this is, again, part of a national thing. One way I've explained this to reporters is that, you can kind of think, of course, we're waiting to see what the Supreme Court does with the VRA, but you can almost think of this as like, Texas canceling out California, Utah canceling out North Carolina, this back and forth between states. Even if Virginia does pass a map where Democrats get 3-4 seats, Another state that's looking at mid-decade redistricting is down in Florida. That's one where Republicans might be able to kind of gain. So I agree that for political nerds, it's fascinating. I kind of joke that for us, this is good because like it's got more people interested in our work, but like for the country, for
It's not,
democracy, probably not the
not
best
the
fit.
best. It's not the best. Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting. In California, one of the most threatened Republican members there, Kevin Kiley, in the U.S. House of Representatives, a Republican, actually put forward legislation basically to halt future mid-decade redistricting. And I do, I've mentioned this, I think, on the podcast before, or in other places where I've talked to people about this, but I do think that if we continue to see this in this cycle and maybe even the next cycle in 2028 or ahead of 2028, especially if the Voting Rights Act is further weakened or overturned in some way, and you have a number of states in the South redistricting, where Republicans generally have control and could draw more districts that favor them, that are currently majority Black districts, in particular. But if this continues, I do wonder about sort of people being like enough at a certain point, and there being enough of a bipartisan agreement that this is insane, because it is insane. I mean, it really is, to see this, and it's going back to a kind of politics that we last saw more so in the late 19th century, where you could see sort of redraw after redraw after redraw for in an effort to gain potentially small partisan advantages. But the thing is, back then, sometimes it backfired. But now the map making,
So
you split counties
scientific.
a lot now. Things
Yeah.
are much more precise now. You got a lot of data to work with. It's easier to draw a map that's gonna withstand the most extreme circumstances.
Yeah.
And things are so polarized, and turnout is relatively high across most elections that if every state gerrymandered, maybe it works out in a wash, is I think what you were saying. But for the people within that state, it is not an example of good governance or good representation. Well, hey, Miles, thank you so much for coming on. We obviously hit on Minnesota and we hit on the best state in the country, Virginia. I know you might say that about Louisiana, but I as a
Well,
Virginia native, I have to give Virginia some love. We'll be talking about Virginia more as this redistricting thing goes on, and if Amy Klobuchar decides to run, I'm sure Minnesota will be a much more interesting topic of conversation moving forward. So I really appreciate you coming on and chatting with all this, sharing your
yeah.
analyses. You've always got so many amazing takes, and well-founded takes, I should say.
Yes.
So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing those with us.
Sure. One maybe funny story we can end on is so
Please.
at the Center for Politics is every time we have a guest here who's like an elected official or a former elected official, I'll print up one of their maps for them to sign. One of the maps behind me, this one in Georgia. We a few years ago we had Brad Raffensperger here, the Secretary of State of Georgia, and it was a shock to everyone that he was renominated without a runoff in 22. So I printed up that. I had him sign. I had him sign it for me. So this must have been shortly after the election. We hosted Speaker Don Scott here, the Speaker of the House of Delegates,
In
and
Virginia,
I'm like,
yeah,
oh,
Virginia's Speaker of the House. Yes.
yeah, so I'm like, okay, so I'll do this one. So basically, what this shows is like, this is a map of the House of Delegates selections, and the light blue ones are the seats that Democrats picked up. So I'm like, okay, so I knew that he was an Aggie. But over the course of his talk, he mentioned that he went to law school at LSU. So I'm like, oh, cool. I did not know that. So after he gets his talk with Professor Sabato, I go up to him. I asked him to sign my map, and I'm like, well, Speaker Scott, I didn't know you went to LSU. Could I get you to sign it also with the Go Tigers? And he says, I like you, but I can't do that because I'm an Aggie first. I'm like, okay, I respect that. So
Texas A&M Aggie, to clarify,
yeah.
there are a few Aggies. So
Oh
A&M,
yeah.
the most well-known Aggies, Texas A&M. Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, I always do love you getting the signatures of you put together a map, or you've usually already put it together without any intention, and then you happen to have the map and you say, hey, would you please sign this? So that's a very fun collection. Your current backdrop is much nicer than mine. So I gotta get to work. I have some political buttons I need to put up, but I just haven't put them up yet. So, well, Miles, thanks again so much. This has been J. Miles Coleman, the associate editor of Sabbath's Crystal Ball, newsletter from the University of Virginia Center for Politics. Wahoo wah, go Who's. I'm a UVA grad. And I'm Jeffrey Skelly, the chief elections analyst at Decision Desk HQ. Thanks for joining us on this discussion about Minnesota and Virginia.